My son-in-law thought I was just a poor farmer, until he tried to steal my land. My son-in-law never paid much attention to me. To Victor Marchetti, I was just an old man with dirty boots, a rusty truck, and a quiet life on a small property outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Behind my back, he called me the farmer. His friends laughed every time he said it. His parents smiled politely whenever I showed up for dinner, but never really talked to me. None of that bothered me. People often see only what they want to see. Victor saw an old widower living in a yellow house on a gravel road. He saw faded jeans, paint stains, and a man who spoke softly. What he never saw was the truth, and that mistake cost him everything. My name is Jiro Beaumont. I am 69 years old. Before retirement, I spent 32 years working as a structural engineer. I live alone now with my dog Pepper in the same yellow house where my late wife Irene and I raised our daughter Clara. Irene passed away 4 years ago. She was careful with everything. She kept receipts in old shoe boxes, wrote notes on scraps of paper, and believed that real wealth should stay quiet. Money doesn't need applause, she used to say. I never forgot that. Clara grew up in that house. We were never flashy, but we were comfortable. We worked hard, saved carefully, and stayed out of unnecessary attention. Then Clara met Victor. Victor Marchetti walked into her life, wearing expensive suits and driving a silver luxury car that probably cost more than my first home. He was charming, confident, and always knew exactly what to say. Clara fell in love quickly, and because she loved him, I welcomed him. But there was always something about Victor that bothered me. He judged everything immediately. He looked at my truck with embarrassment. He looked at my home like it was a problem waiting to be fixed. And when he looked at me, he saw a harmless old man who would agree to anything. He was wrong. The Marchetti family owned a company called Marchetti Industrial Supply. Victor's father, Donato Marchetti, built a company in 1986 from almost nothing. He started with one warehouse and only a few workers. Over time, the company became one of the biggest industrial supply distributors in the Gulf South. They supplied ports, oil refineries, construction sites, and manufacturing plants across several states. Donato earned every bit of that success. But back in 2001, everything almost collapsed. A major refinery contract froze millions in payments. Lease agreements were expiring. Cash flow disappeared overnight. Donato needed help fast. Not public help, quiet help. At the time, my engineering company had worked with Marchetti Industrial on several large projects. Donato trusted me. One evening, he came to my kitchen table and told me the full truth. No lies, no pride, just fear. He said he was about to lose everything. Irene and I had spent years saving money. We lived simply. No debt, no expensive hobbies, no need to impress anybody. So we made a decision. Through our holding company, GB Capital, we invested $310 million into Marchetti Industrial in exchange for a 53% controlling stake. But we asked for one thing: silence. Donato kept his position. His name stayed on the buildings. He remained the face of the company. Only 4 people knew the truth: Donato, Irene, my attorney Bernard Cole, and me. That investment changed everything. Over the next 22 years, Marchetti Industrial exploded in value. Expansion into offshore equipment, environmental systems, and energy infrastructure made the company worth billions. Our original investment eventually grew into more than $5 billion. But Victor never knew. When Donato stepped away 4 years earlier, Victor became CEO. He inherited power he believed belonged completely to him. That misunderstanding would become his biggest mistake. Everything started changing on a Wednesday morning in October. Victor suddenly called me. That alone was unusual. He invited me to lunch and acted strangely friendly. He asked about my garden. He asked about Pepper. He smiled the entire time, but he never explained why he wanted to meet. 3 days later, I learned the reason. My neighbor Franklin, who used to work in city planning, called me after attending a parish council meeting. He said a development proposal had just been submitted for a huge distribution and logistics center. Then he mentioned something that made me sit down immediately. The access road for the project would run directly through the back corner of my property, 2 acres behind my garden, the same land Irene always called the quiet corner. Franklin read me the project name. It belonged to a Marchetti Industrial subsidiary. I stayed silent for a long time after the call ended. Pepper rested his head on my knee while I stared at the kitchen wall. Then I called Bernard Cole. Bernard had been my attorney for 26 years. He was 71 years old, calm under pressure, and smarter than most men in any boardroom. I told him about the project. I told him about Victor suddenly taking me to lunch. And Bernard asked me one simple question. Should I prepare Clause 22? Clause 22 was hidden deep inside the original shareholder agreement. It stated that any executive using company power, resources, or influence against a controlling shareholder for personal benefit could be immediately removed after a board vote. Bernard insisted on adding that clause years ago. Now it mattered. I told him to prepare everything. Emergency board notice, legal filings, termination paperwork, all of it. The next few days, I lived normally. I watered the garden. I cleaned my truck. I sat on the porch at sunset. But underneath that calm routine, I was waiting. On Friday morning, Bernard called back. He said 2 board members were already prepared to support action against Victor. One was Patricia Odom, a sharp and fearless woman who had been on the board for over a decade. The other was Raymond Castile, one of Donato's oldest investors. Neither trusted Victor anymore. Then, the following Tuesday, Victor finally arrived at my house. Right on schedule. He stepped out of the silver car, wearing a designer jacket and carrying a leather folder. His smile looked practiced, like a man already celebrating a victory. He sat at my kitchen table and slid a white envelope toward me. He explained that Marchetti Industrial was planning a major expansion project and needed a small adjustment involving my property. Then he said something I will never forget. We want to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of? Like I was some weak old man who needed permission to survive. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was an offer letter. The company wanted to buy my 2 acres for $87,000. I almost laughed. Franklin had already shown me the development paperwork. The project connected to that access road was expected to generate over $400 million. And Victor thought I would hand over Irene's land for $87,000. I kept my face calm. I offered him water, coffee. He refused both. Then I told him I needed time to think. Victor smiled again. No problem, he said, but the timeline is tight. Then he added Clara's name. Again, he said Clara would feel relieved once everything was settled. That caught my attention immediately. When he left, I called Bernard, and Bernard gave me even worse news. The company had already filed permit paperwork listing my property as pending acquisition. Victor had already told the city the land belonged to them before I had agreed to anything. He never came to negotiate. He came expecting obedience. The following week, I said nothing to Clara. She called me like always, talking about work and everyday life. She sounded happy. I couldn't bring myself to ruin that over the phone. Instead, I waited. Then I invited Victor and the Marchetti family to dinner on Saturday night. Victor happily accepted. He even said he would bring Donato and Elena. That surprised me. Saturday evening arrived. I cooked a full dinner. Chicken, rice, green beans from the garden. I used the good plates Irene loved. Everything looked normal. But under the surface, tension filled the room. Victor acted confident the entire evening. Donato barely spoke. Elena tried to keep conversation moving. Clara had no idea what was coming. Dessert finally arrived. That was when Victor made his move. He smiled warmly and said family should solve things peacefully. Then he slid another envelope across the table. This one was thicker. He said the company had increased the offer significantly out of respect. He told me all I had to do was sign, and everyone could go home happy. I picked up the envelope. Then I placed it back on the table unopened. And I said quietly, before we discuss the property, there's something all of you should see. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Earlier that afternoon, Bernard had sent me a document. I opened the file and turned the screen toward Victor. At first, he looked relaxed. Then his entire face changed. The document listed the ownership structure of Marchetti Industrial. Victor personally owned 4%. The Marchetti Family Trust owned 32%. Other institutional investors held the rest. But at the top of the list sat one name, GB Capital LLC, 53.4% controlling interest. And directly below that was a sentence written by Bernard. GB Capital is the registered holding company of Gerald and Irene Beaumont. The room went completely silent. Victor stared at the screen. Donato lowered his eyes. Elena slowly set down her fork. Clara looked back and forth between us. Then I said the words Victor never expected to hear. I've owned this company for 22 years. Victor leaned back slowly like the air had been knocked out of him. For the first time since I met him, he looked afraid. He immediately claimed there had to be some legal issue, some mistake. I calmly told him there was none. Then I looked at Donato. He said nothing, but his silence confirmed everything. Victor started panicking. He said hidden ownership at that level couldn't possibly be legal. He threatened to call lawyers immediately. I told him he was welcome to. Then I called Bernard and placed him on speakerphone. Bernard answered calmly. He confirmed he represented GB Capital in all matters. Then, in the quietest voice imaginable, he destroyed Victor's world. Bernard formally announced that GB Capital was activating Clause 22 of the shareholder agreement. He stated that Victor had abused company authority to pressure a controlling shareholder into a below-market land transfer. He explained that all evidence had already been documented. Board members had been notified. An emergency meeting had been scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Victor exploded. He jumped from his chair and called the situation ridiculous. He insisted the property deal was normal business. But Bernard kept speaking. He explained that Victor's permit filings falsely implied the land had already been secured. He explained that company employees and resources had been used improperly. And worst of all, every document had already been delivered to Patricia Odom and Raymond Castile. Victor looked stunned. Then Donato finally spoke. Gerald, just my name. Nothing else. When I looked at him, he appeared exhausted, older than I had ever seen him. He admitted he never knew about the false permit filings. He said Victor told him everything was being handled correctly. Then he quietly apologized, and I believed him. Donato had many flaws, but lying was never one of them. I told him I knew this wasn't his doing. That's why the action targeted Victor alone. Victor started pacing around the kitchen. He shouted that he had increased company revenue by 30%. He claimed he had spent 4 years building the company. He called the entire situation a family disagreement being turned into corporate warfare. I calmly disagreed. Then I reminded him he could explain himself to the board Monday morning, if he still had a seat by then. Bernard added that Patricia Odom had already reviewed the evidence and was prepared to vote. That statement hit Victor hard, because suddenly he realized this wasn't a warning. It was already happening. And despite everything, I felt no joy. That's the truth. I wasn't celebrating. Donato had been my friend for over 20 years. Elena was sitting in my kitchen holding untouched dessert. My daughter Clara was watching her marriage crack apart in front of her eyes. And Victor was finally seeing the consequences of underestimating people. I looked around the table and spoke carefully. I didn't invite everyone here to destroy a family. I said, I invited everyone here because Victor came into my home twice carrying envelopes and using my daughter's name like leverage. Nobody interrupted. I was never selling that land, I continued. Not for $87,000. Not for any amount. Irene loved that part of the property. And the only reason this situation exists is because Victor believed I was too old, too quiet, and too simple to say no. Victor stopped pacing. He stared at me without speaking. The confidence was gone now. Completely gone. I ended the call with Bernard and placed the phone back on the table. The kitchen became painfully quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees behind the house. Pepper lifted his head from under the table and looked toward Victor. Clara finally spoke. Her voice sounded small. Victor, is any of this untrue? Victor opened his mouth immediately, then stopped. That silence answered her question better than words ever could. Clara looked down at her plate. I could see heartbreak spreading across her face slowly. Not dramatic, not loud, just real. Donato rubbed both hands over his face. Elena looked close to tears. And Victor suddenly looked like a man standing on thin ice. He tried one final time. He said the property acquisition was smart business. He said emotions were making everyone overreact. Then he looked directly at me. You could have handled this privately. I nodded once. You could have asked honestly. That ended the conversation. Nobody touched dessert after that. Eventually Donato stood up first. He looked at me with shame in his eyes and quietly thanked me for not humiliating him publicly. Then he told Clara he was sorry. Elena hugged Clara tightly before leaving. Victor stayed frozen near the kitchen counter, like he still couldn't process what had happened. Before walking out, he turned toward me one last time. You planned this, he said. I shook my head slowly. No, Victor, I replied. You planned this. You just never imagined I could read the map. Then he left. The silver car disappeared down the gravel road, and the house became quiet again. Clara stayed behind after everyone else left. We sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, without speaking much. Finally, she asked me one question. Why didn't you ever tell me? I looked around the house, at Irene's old curtains, at Pepper asleep near the door, at the life we built quietly. Then I answered honestly, because money changes how people see you. Clara wiped tears from her eyes, and for the first time that night, she smiled slightly. Not because she was happy, but because she finally understood. Monday morning arrived. The emergency board meeting lasted less than 2 hours. Clause 22 passed. Victor was removed as CEO effective immediately. Patricia Odom became interim chief executive, while the company reorganized leadership. Donato later called me personally. He apologized again. Then he asked if we could still remain friends. I told him friendship survives mistakes, but pride destroys people. Months later, the development project was redesigned entirely around my property. The quiet corner stayed untouched, exactly the way Irene loved it. Victor and Clara separated 6 months after the board vote. It hurt all of us, but sometimes truth arrives late, and when it does, it changes everything. Today, I still live in the yellow house. I still drive the same old truck. Pepper still sleeps under the kitchen table. Most people in town still think I'm just an old retired engineer with a garden. And honestly, I prefer it that way, because the loudest people in the room usually miss the most important details. Victor looked at my boots and saw a poor farmer.